Be covering female reproductive functions. This is corresponding to page 222 of your notebook. This first slide shows us an overview. We've already talked about this a little bit through the anatomical structures. Just like we started with male reproduction physiology, we talked about spermatogenesis. Here we're going to talk about oogenesis, so the production of the eggs, and then the ovarian cycle, so the hormonal cycle that controls the release of that egg. So some differences between male and female reproduction. Uh, Women are born with all of the eggs they could potentially have. They are in a primitive state, but they're already there and they don't make new ones. Unlike males that had those spermatogonia or those sperm stem cells, which could keep doing mitosis through their entire life, potentially, um, a woman is born with a fixed number. And then reproductive ability usually begins at puberty, but can end in the 50s. Now that is called menopause, which is the end of the ability to release eggs, but it could happen before the 50s. It could happen later. It varies from individual to individual. So keep in mind for this entire section of notes that we're talking about um, statistically, what do you see for most people in the population? But that can vary from individual to individual. So oogenesis is making the eggs or the oocytes. This general stages that we're going to go through here is we're going to start with stem cells called oogonium. They're going to reproduce themselves through mitosis. So we see here the cloning process, uh, a diploid number, two complete sets of chromosomes, okay? And then it cloned itself and cloned itself. So eventually, these are going to go on, and now they're going to start meiosis. Now, when we produce the sperm, meiosis starts and goes straight to completion. That's a little bit different for the eggs. They're going to start and they're going to do the first stage of meiosis, and that's going to be the production of a primary oocyte. So we are going to reduce that number of chromosomes to haploid or one set. But then meiosis sort of arrests itself, it stops. And that pause is going to be continued later on as we release an egg. So we're going to get to a secondary oocyte, and then we'll see the rest of the stages here in a minute. So oogonia is a female stem cell. This is developing in the female fetus. So that mitosis we were talking about is really happening in the fetus. And those primary oocytes are those daughter cells. So now, what are they going to do? They're going to push into the ovaries connective tissue and become surrounded in a layer of cells to form what's called a primary follicle. Now, by birth, all of those stem cells have gone away. That's why there's a fixed supply of oocytes. And those cells are inside a layer of cells called a follicle. So there's about 2 million of these, but by puberty, that number gets reduced to 400,000. So that's still a very large number of eggs when you consider that you're only going to release one per month. And they need to be completing meiosis yet to become functional. So at this point, they're not fully developed. So the ovarian cycle are all the changes that are going to occur to the ovary within a month. Typically, there's only one ovulation a month. Now, that could vary. There could be, obviously, there's twins and triplets. And then if somebody's on fertility drugs, that could increase this number. But again, we're talking usually one per month. Fewer than 500 of these eggs are going to be released out of those 400 in a woman's lifetime. You know, you're talking 12 a year. And so if this is going to go from the teenage years into the 50s, that's going to be fewer than 500 eggs total released on average. Now, here's an overview of going from being stem cells to what are called primordial follicles. And then we're going to go to a primary follicle, a secondary follicle, a tertiary follicle. We're going to see ovulation, and then we're going to have a structure form again called the corpus luteum. So let's kind of take a closer look at each of these stages. So in the beginning here, these are the occurring in the fetus. These are diploid cells, so 2 complete sets of chromosomes. And then they're going to form, at this stage here, a primary oocyte. So this here would be a single cell, and then the nucleus would be inside that. And in that nucleus, there would only be 23 chromosomes right now. That is surrounded by a layer of flat cells. So this is squamous cells. And these are located really in the cortex of the ovary, so the outer layer of the ovary. So you've got an egg surrounded by another layer of cells. So at that point, it is a type of follicle. Now, that follicle is going to go on and develop. So this layer of cells here goes from being squamous and they become cuboidal, and then they start to divide over and over and over again. So we're going to get layers of cells in this primary follicle. And so these are now called granulosa cells, and they can actually start producing estrogen. So this is only going to occur at puberty. And so these estrogen levels start to be released, and that plays a role in secondary sex characteristic development. Now, looking at this as it continues to develop, that those cells start to open up pockets in them. And these little pockets are antrum, and they fill with fluid. And then eventually those fuse together. And then that um, secondary oocyte gets pushed to the side. So notice here, we've already done the first meiotic division, okay? That's going to continue into the second meiotic division. It hasn't actually completed. That's one of the interesting things about the timing of this process. We're going to see how meiosis completes actually later on. But right now, we do have a secondary oocyte. And so that oocyte is right here. Now, we can't in this picture distinguish the cell membrane and the oocyte really from this layer of cells that are inside. So notice there's a layer outside, and these cells are the Graafian follicle. There's a fluid-filled chamber here, and then there's another layer of cells, and then inside that layer of cells is the secondary oocyte. So this layer here is called the corona radiata, which means like a radiating crown. And then when it goes on, this layer of cells of the follicle, this part of the follicle stays behind in the ovary. This part of the follicle is released. Basically, luteinizing hormone is a trigger that almost like pops this like a bubble. And all the fluid that's been building up here has been creating pressure, and that pressure sweeps it out, and it's carried with that fluid from the surface of the ovary. But this ruptured structure is left behind. So those cells close up and become the corpus luteum, which again means yellow body, becomes a glandular tissue. Eventually, that's going to break down. And this part goes on. This was ovulation. And then right here, this is now the remaining follicle cells with that oocyte inside it. Okay. And then this just gives you another version of that, which you can pause it and go back and look at it, or it's in the Google Slides. So follicle stimulating hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, and it starts to tell some of those follicles to start maturing. So they go from primary to secondary. And that antrum is that fluid filled area in the center that starts to grow. The primary oocytes, replicate their chromosomes and begin meiosis. So we do the first meiotic division to produce two sex cells, but they're not the same in size. Unlike the sperm, which are pretty uniform, one of them is the secondary oocyte, which is a larger cell, and another one's a smaller cell called a polar body. And so here we have a secondary oocyte and then its polar body with it. At this point, we have a mature follicle, sometimes referred to as a tertiary follicle. Another name for this is Graphian. And it rises to the surface of the ovary. It actually looks like a sore on its surface. It looks like a boil. And it eventually ruptures and it releases that. The follicle development to this stage takes about 14 days, and ovulation occurs at this time. Okay, so here is an ovary, and here is looks like a sore. That's the secondary oocyte inside getting ready to be ruptured and released. Okay, so here we have literally a hole in the surface of an ovary where an egg has recently been released. Luteinizing hormone is really a signal that stimulates ovulation. So there's this big burst or release of a high concentration of this hormone for about 24 to 48 hours, and that stimulates ovulation. It also causes the ruptured follicle to become the corpus luteum. Obviously, all of this is a complex chemical reaction in a series of steps, but this is the end result. So the corpus luteum is now a glandular structure. It'll eventually deteriorate. Ovulation then is the release of that secondary oocyte, and it is surrounded by the corona radiata. So the follicle cell is a capsule that surrounds it and goes with it. Some women actually have the ability to know when they've ovulated. They feel this sort of abdominal pain that's associated with it. Um, and so that is something that some women experience, not all. And so that, again, that goes from person to person. Here we see stained in sort of purple, these are cells clinging to the surface of the secondary oocyte. So here's the oocyte inside. And then this sort of pink layer between it is called the zona pellucida. That is sort of like a jelly-like substance. Okay, so we're going to see this when we talk about fertilization. So usually each month only one follicle becomes dominant. It gets ovulated into the peritoneal cavity, which we talked about before, and then it has to get picked up by the end of the fallopian tube and get moved through that by peristalsis. Now, there are others that we're trying to develop at the same time. And it seems like a weird term to use to say that they became overripe. Um, like a term you might use for fruit, but that is a medical term that is used. So they did not get released, and so then those ones that are left behind deteriorate. So the body just reabsorbs them. Now, in terms of fertilization by the sperm, the secondary oocyte is what gets fertilized, and that process actually is a trigger for it to complete the final stage of meiosis 2. So remember, in meiosis, it does prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, but it does that twice. And one of those is the reduction division, which cuts the chromosome number from having 2 complete sets down to 1 set. So at this stage, that completes, and we have what's now referred to as an ovum. That's what's going to combine with the 23 chromosomes of the sperm. So you get 1 set of 23 from mom, 1 set of 23 from dad, and we're going to have a fertilized egg. This also forms another one of those polar bodies. So we do start with 1 cell an end with 4, just like in the sperm. But in this case, what we're looking at is only 1 functional egg and 3 that are not. The polar body has a little bit of cytoplasm, and generally it degenerates. It has some other functions as well, but we're not going to cover it at this level of the course. So looking at sort of the steps here, um, this was those primitive stem cells, the oogonium. Fetally, they cloned themselves by mitosis. Prior to being born, they did go on to, and they disappear, so we no longer have those stem cells, but they become the primordial follicles. So we have oocytes that are contained within them. The sperm fertilizing the egg really is what completes the split of the ovum in the second polar body. And then the nuclei of the sperm cell has to go on and fuse with the nuclei of that ovum. And that is what's going to make it be a zygote. So here, what we see is we've got the egg. There's a jelly-like substance surrounding it called the zona pellucida. That is surrounded in a bunch of these cells, which are the corona radiata. So here come the sperm. And what are they doing? They are using those acrosomes. They have that digestive enzyme, and they're breaking their way through this layer of cells until they can get to this zone. And they're trying to get through that to the surface of this membrane where there are some receptors that can then inject its DNA in here. Now, there is a reaction that happens once the egg is fertilized by a sperm that makes it impermeable to all other sperm. So only one sperm is able to get in, which is good because we don't want additional chromosomes. Those would cause developmental problems and really not be viable. But it is this process here of this fertilization that is going to cause this to complete its second meiotic division. So right now it's suspended, it's ready to complete. This is going to give it that trigger, and it's going to complete meiosis. Now, if a secondary oocyte is not fertilized, then it never completes, and becomes a functional ovum. So some differences, again, between gametogenesis in males and females. Okay, gamete formation. Meiosis forms 4 functional sperm in males, but only 1 functional egg in females. Sperm are motile, they can swim, eggs cannot. Sperm have very little nutrients, but eggs are actually stocked with lots of nutrients, and they're much larger in size as well. We're going to see this more when we talk about development in pregnancy. So that's really the development of the egg. Now, how is all this regulated? Now we're talking about the menstrual cycle. So these are the changes, not of the ovary. That was just the ovarian cycle. We talked about what happens to it. Now that is coordinated with the menstrual cycle, and that's really talking about the inner lining of the uterus. What's happening to that endometrium? And so this is also called the uterine cycle. So there's only a brief time when a fertilized egg can actually implant, and that's about 7 days after ovulation. So again, eventually that egg had to be fertilized in the fallopian tube. It's going to work its way down that uterine tube or fallopian tube, and it's going to kind of come into this space in the uterus. Now, the inner lining is the endometrium. That's what's going to have to accept the egg for implantation. And then the thickness of it is the myometrium again, which is smooth muscle. So it's not actually ready, and it actually hangs out here for a while before it implants. We'll talk about that more during the development video. But back to the hormones, the ovarian hormones are estrogen and progesterone. And then the anterior pituitary hormones are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both cycles take about 28 days. Again, this is the classic example. This can vary. So let's look at kind of what's happening here. When you see one of these diagrams, it can seem like information overload, but if we just look at it at one part at a time, it'll make sense. So let's start with the part that we've been talking about right along. Okay, we have the development of an egg. So events that are occurring inside the ovaries. One follicle is developing during the month. We see it getting larger, filling with fluid, triggering ovulation right here. And then that structure that's left behind becomes the corpus luteum. And then eventually that decays. And then we're going to start all over again with a different one at the end of this cycle. Now, what are we talking about for gonadotropins? So what's released from the anterior pituitary? Well, at a low level, we have follicle stimulating hormone, and it starts to increase. That follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicles to grow. Now, luteinizing hormone has been building up during this time too, and then it spikes or surges for that 24 to 48-hour window. And this is going to be at like day 14, 15 here. And that's going to trigger the ovulation. So it's really luteinizing hormone that triggers ovulation. Now, as that follicle is growing, it is the follicle cells that release estrogen, those granulosa cells. So here's the estrogen level, it's low. Now that we're getting a follicle to be developed, the estrogen levels are spiking. And so that kind of coordinates with this. Okay. Now look at right here, progesterone levels are really pretty low. Well, right now we have a corpus luteum formed, and look at the levels go up. That progesterone is actually produced by the corpus luteum. And that's going to make more sense once we get into the stages of development. We're going to see these again and put all these pieces together. We're going to see that there's three phases. There's the menses phase. Okay, so this is really the shedding of the lining. So what we're seeing here is the relative thickness of the endometrium, that inner layer. And so for those first 5 days, they're showing the sloughing off and release of that tissue and that blood. Then we're in a follicular stage, and then we're in the luteal stage. So we're going to come back and talk about those. This is the same thing, just showing you a different picture of it. Another thing to point out here is body temperature actually changes a little bit, average body temperature, to coordinate a little bit with these hormones. So, stages of the cycle, the menstrual phase, what's happening? On average, we're talking here is about 5 days. It can be shorter, it can certainly be longer. This can be very light, it could be a very heavy, thick, and large amount of tissue. It depends from person to person. But that sort of bleeding phase is about 3 to 5 days. So that tissue is detaching and it's passing through the vagina and leaving the body. So the average blood loss here is about a quarter to a half a cup of um, total fluid here. By day 5, the ovarian follicles are beginning to produce more estrogen again because they're starting to develop. So now we're in what's called the proliferative phase. We've shed that lining. So for days 6 to 14, roughly, what's happening here is we have estrogen being produced by those growing follicles. And so the layers of the endometrium start to regenerate and become functional. They literally grow glands, literally grow a blood supply. So new capillaries are put down. So for those who are not familiar, when you talk about the period, it's not just blood, it's literally tissue and organs that are being grown. And then, if they're not used to support a developing egg and potentially a fetus, then they're shed. So the ovarian, this cycle actually goes right up to ovulation, which is the end of this stage, and that's really marked by the luteinizing hormone. So now we go what's called the secretory phase. What are we secreting here? We're secreting progesterone from day 15 to 28. That is released by the corpus luteum. It causes the endometrium to increase its blood supply even more. Why? We're trying to prepare this lining to accept potentially a fertilized egg. And so progesterone is preventing the shedding of this lining, and it's actually encouraging it to grow at this stage. Now, what happens if fertilization occurs? Well, the embryo actually produces a luteinizing hormone like hormone. So that was a little wordy, but what does that mean? It produces a new hormone that's similar to luteinizing hormone. So it's not luteinizing hormone, but it's going to have a similar effect. What's that do? Causes the corpus luteum to continue to produce its hormones. So the embryo itself produces a hormone that gets into the bloodstream, travels to the ovary, targets this corpus luteum here, and tells it to keep producing its hormone. Well, what's its hormone? Corpus luteum is now going to release progesterone. So as long as we have an embryo, a fertilized egg, that's going to tell the corpus luteum to keep doing what it's doing. That's going to keep producing progesterone. And what's the progesterone doing? It's telling that lining to stay put. It's growing it, preparing itself for implantation. What happens if there is no fertilization? Well, there is no embryo, and therefore there is none of this luteinizing like hormone. Okay, so that means the corpus luteum isn't getting that signal to keep working, so it degenerates. Well, what happens? It's gone. So now it's not releasing progesterone. Well, progesterone was what was telling that endometrium lining to stay put. So now it goes into spasms, it kinks, it begins to die, it detaches, and then that is the menses. So really here, we're ending this cycle and we're starting the next one by counting it as the blood flow as it starts that. So that classical cycle is 28 days, but there can be quite a bit of variety among individuals. It could be as short as 21 days, and it could be as long as 40 days. And it could be other things as well. There's always unique situations for individuals, but pretty much the majority of the population is close to this 28-day cycle or falls within this range. However, despite this range of days, whether it's 21 days on the shorter end or 40 days on the longer end, the beginning of the menses, okay, ovulation is always 14 to 15 days after the beginning of that menses. So on a calendar, it's something that can be tracked pretty consistently. Estrogen is produced by a growing and mature follicle cells. So that's then going to target the ovaries. Again, hormones target other hormones. And so this can cause secondary sex characteristics. So for a female, we think obviously of the development of breast tissue. We think about pubic hair and axillary hair and some of the other changes. But internally also, there's growth of the uterine tubes. The uterus itself gets bigger. The genitals actually get bigger. So there's lots of other changes that occur as well. Some of those are depositing body fat beneath the skin, especially in the hip and breast region. The skeleton actually changes as it did for males. So the pelvis can widen and lighten in some cases. And then the menstrual cycle can be beginning. Progesterone is made by the corpus luteum. So as long as there's a corpus luteum, as long as there's luteinizing hormone, it will sustain a corpus luteum, but usually it stops after 10 to 14 days. Now, eventually that corpus luteum is going to go away. So if you have a pregnancy, eventually a placenta will develop. It's not there immediately, it takes time, but once it's there, it takes over the job of the corpus luteum by making progesterone. So now the ovaries aren't responsible for the progesterone anymore. The placenta is. And the placenta will continue to tell that wall not to shed. So while a woman's pregnant, you would not expect her to be getting her period. She shouldn't be losing any of that lining of the wall because it's being used as part of the pregnancy. So just kind of wrapping this up here, we're going to talk about this in development. Fertilization and pregnancy are not the same thing. Okay. Fertilization, and what we're talking here are medical definitions. Fertilization is going to be the sperm entering the egg, and now we're going to have a zygote. That zygote then travels and it starts to develop. As soon as that thing starts splitting, that's now called an embryo. And it's going to be an embryo whether it's like 4 cells, 100 cells. It's going to be called an embryo up to about week 8 or 9. And there's some different ways of classifying that as to whether they're going to consider it at week 8 or 9. After that time, though, then they call it a fetus. But as soon as it's fertilized, it travels to the uterus. It doesn't implant right away. It doesn't attach itself to that lining. Once it does attach itself to the lining, that's considered pregnancy. Okay, and just as a definition. And so we'll talk about this more in the final set of notes of development. And if you have any questions, let me know.